Episode 4. The First Resistance. The light from the Eclipse's lance had scarcely faded from human memory when the Terran Accord confronted the thing it had created. In the red shadows above Mars, wreckage still drifted, sheets of torn alloy, darkened foam of shattered hull insulation, the unlit bones of escorts that would never fire again. Shipyards hummed without pause, a ceaseless clatter of rivet and arc welder heat washing over the metal skin of a civilization that refused to be cold. Across the worlds of the Accord, the victory was replayed until the images seemed older than the battle itself. The white column of annihilation, the Elythian cruiser erasing like chalk in rain, the stunned stillness that followed. Humanity had done more than survive. It had struck back. Yet awe is a poor planner. In the councils that had once brokered treaties, a new question filled the air. What is the nature of a hammer that can split the sky? Some voices, hard as armor, argued that the Eclipse must never be risked except at the brink of extinction. It was a symbol as much as a weapon, the keystone holding up the morale of a species. Other voices, mathematical, logistical, merciless, insisted a symbol unused decays into myth. If the Eclipse was the tip of the spear, then the spear must be thrown. Debate did not linger long. The war had cured humanity of its taste for delay. The decision that emerged was not a single answer, but an architecture of answers, a doctrine capable of swallowing contradiction and exhaling coordination. The Eclipse would not be a solitary savior, nor a hallowed relic. It would be a node, the heaviest point in a lattice of ships, platforms, and planets, all tuned to a single purpose. To give the lattice a mind, the Accord fused its scattered command nets into a coherent, redundant web of direction, distributed, auto-healing, immune to decapitation. To give it reach, the Accord bound the orbits of Earth and Mars with continuous relays mirrored through Lagrange citadels and the Bulwark rings. To give it teeth, the shipyards sang. Doctrine began as a sketch on the galaxy's old parchment of failure. The Aegis frigates, born from the skeletons of freighters, became the foam of the wave, screens of motion, nets of interference, patterns of chaff and heat, and false returns that thickened space with indecision. Hammerfall destroyers were the knives hidden in that foam, sprinting through gaps made of noise and sacrifice, ejecting torpedoes in fan-shaped curtains and letting rail batteries speak in chords of tungsten and thunder. The Ironclad cruisers were the anchor points, slow arcs of inevitability that refused to be moved, around which smaller ships swarmed like iron filings tracing an invisible field. The bulwarks wrote the grammar of place. Where a bulwark stood, space was different, heavier, defensive, thick with overlapping saturations of point defense and shield geometry. The Eclipse, singular, patient, newly reverent of its recoil and its limits, became conductor and hammer both. A moving horizon that erased shapes the doctrine could not bend. Doctrine by itself is a drawing. To become a world, it needed industry. The Accord remapped its economics into corridors, ore from the belt to Luna's foundries, superconductors from Europa's ice caverns, mined by heat-borer rigs now wearing armor, to the coil yards over Earth. Reactor salts refined on Mercury and launched outward in inert canisters, shepherded by Aegis squadrons that flew like bees around a queen. Every corridor had a shadow corridor, decoys, ghost shipments, believable fiction. Elythian reconnaissance learned to read the obvious. Humanity taught it to misread the inevitable. Education, too, rearranged its furniture. The academies that had once staged debates between schools of interspecies ethics now ran continuous simulations that stitched the physics of dust and gravity to the psychology of panic and the mathematics of failure. Children of the war generation learned to think in vectors and cones of fire and the emergent logics of 1,000 simple decisions made at once. They learned that a formation is not a set of positions, but a set of promises. I will be here when your shield breaks. I will draw fire when you cannot breathe. I will not run alone. With doctrine came practice, and practice meant risk. The Accord chose its first counteroffensive not for glory, but for need. Beyond Neptune's slow cold and the thin hail of the Kuiper rubble, a narrow thread of transit geometry hung unused since the days of peace. The route had mattered once for commerce, shortening by weeks the passage of refined ice and rare isotopes. But in war, it mattered because the Elythians might someday need it, and because humanity needed to show itself that it could fight for something not yet on fire. The target was not a fortress or a fleet, but a future. They named the operation with the plainness of a civilization that had outgrown ceremony. Intercept Theta. A screen of Aegis frigates swept the approach in loose, untidy skeins. Tidy formations are for parades and funerals. Hammerfalls tucked in behind radio silence. Heat sinks chilled, their hulls wearing dust and paint that made them look like lumps of night. Two ironclads advanced on separated vectors, too far to help one another quickly, close enough to multiply their fields when the geometry turned hard. The Eclipse trailed the formation by minutes that felt like years, distant enough that a trap would spring on anything smaller first, near enough that a call could bring daylight. Elythian scouts arrived because scouts always do. A galaxy learns to be predictable when it thinks itself unopposed. They came sleek and bright, light bending along their beveled edges, lances probing for edges, in a sky muddied by human noise. The Aegis screen thickened, each frigate flashing, vanishing, reappearing where equations advised a greater chance of living 5 seconds longer. Living 5 seconds longer meant someone else on some other vector might live 10. Hammerfalls flared from hiding and then hit again, emptying torpedo racks into the glittering wake of confusion. When the first Elythian ship exploded, no light, only the sudden absence of a shape. The human net did not cheer. It tightened. The scouts did their work. They found the outline of the human advance, read the lazy pulse of mass and intent, and called their elders. The Elythian response seeded the dark with more brightness, cruisers and cutters arranging themselves like the facets of a knife. They expected the old prey, panic, retreat, the clatter of cohesion failing. What met them was a shape new to the war, a curtain of false targets, thick as a storm of snow, destroyers appearing at what looked like the wrong moments to fire, at what looked like the wrong angles, cruisers that seemed content to be where they had chosen to be, forcing the enemy to chart a path around their stubbornness. The first serious exchange of lances and rails burned away misreadings. Under the noise, a structure held. When the Eclipse arrived, the battle did not pivot with spectacle. It bent with arithmetic. One Elythian cruiser died, abruptly, like a clause ending. The human formation did not chase the thrill. It tightened again, contracted around the space that had been denied, and then backed away in good order, freighted with the knowledge that this lane would not be simple again. The goal had not been to annihilate. It had been to write a message in a place the galaxy had forgotten mattered. The message said, "We can reach here. Do not assume you are alone when you are far." After Intercept Theta, the Accord codified what it had learned into the language of rhythm. Shipyards scheduled their deliveries as if composing music. Aegis lines came off the slips in triplets. 3, then a pause, then 3 more, because maintenance crews learned the tempo best preserved sanity. Hammerfalls cycled their crews between live sorties and deep sim immersion in ratios that kept reflex and judgment in balance. Ironclads were given names that were not names: designate north, designate anchor, designate wall, so that no superstition would cling to them when an unlucky hull did not return. Bulwarks received serial hymns, instruction chants synced to the pulse of capacitor banks, recited by thousands inside their shells during drills, a living metronome aligning muscles, attention, and the charge curve of a shield. On Earth, the old museums rewrote their placards. Exhibits once devoted to the textiles of extinct butterflies or the early poems of the first orbiters now displayed the layered cross-sections of armor composites and the genealogies of ironclad decks, showing how failure begat redesign, begat survival. In theaters that still staged plays, the final applause was timed to the interval of an emergency scramble klaxon, so that the sound of joy would never be entirely divorced from the sound of alarm. This was not propaganda, as the ancestors had practiced it. It was identity maintenance, a culture teaching itself that beauty and readiness could be the same word pronounced in different rooms. The Elythians adapted, because predators do. Their next approach was sneer silent: fewer scouts, more sudden mass, an intent to collapse the human weave with a single, overwhelming gesture. They chose the Vesta corridor because Vesta had survived once, and insult still irritates the skin of conquest. Human watchers saw the surge as numbers, not lights. The transit signatures were wrong for supply, too right for vengeance. Doctrine flexed. Aegis clouds thickened where the enemy expected empty lanes. Hammerfalls loaded slugs, etched not for penetration, but for spall, shattering, blooming inside the lattice of Elythian hulls to make repairs a geometry problem without a solution. Ironclads tilted their shield planes to reflect rather than absorb, changing the angles of ricochet to carve safety out of mathematics. The bulwark nearest to the belt bled down its charge into the shield of a passing ironclad as 2 ships briefly kissed fields, then recharged from buried capacitors that drew from the waste heat of 5,000 breathing workers inside. The Eclipse waited, because a hammer is a sentence best saved for the predicate. This time, the exchange lasted hours, not minutes. Aegis crews died and were replaced so swiftly that the board markers tracking call signs were written with erasable inks. A destroyer squadron disappeared and left behind a gap the size of a city. The gap was filled with resolve, translated into thrust vectors and range gates, frictionless and impersonal. An Elythian cruiser endured 3 ironclad volleys and tried to turn away. The Eclipse unwrote it and then was quiet again. The enemy did not break. Elythians seldom break, but they lost the glamour of inevitability. They left because the equations refused to pay out what they had promised. After Vesta, humans let themselves have 1 hour of celebration per world. The hour had rules: no speeches longer than a page, no liquor stronger than the ration, no promises made aloud about tomorrow. Then the hour ended everywhere at once, synchronized to a tone broadcast from Earth's old pole beacons, and all the worlds returned to the math. With rhythm came reach. The Accord dared a deeper push, a raid not upon fighters or lanes, but upon a node the Elythians had built within human knowing. A relay lattice tucked inside the whispering dust between Uranus and Neptune, a place where enemy signals jumped with unnatural grace. To cut such a lattice was to put a tremor in the hands that held the knife at humanity's throat. The operation required choreography finer than any human fleet had attempted. 2 Aegis swarms went out as bait, hot and noisy, screaming presence. A third, cold and silent, crawled on reaction wheels through a darkness so pure the crews prayed aloud to the inert. Hammerfalls coiled in shadow to answer whichever skein drew blood. Ironclads advanced on converging tracks calculated to intersect a volume of space that existed mostly as a conjecture. The Eclipse hung still for 19 minutes that bruised the mind, then moved 4 degrees and waited again. The lattice revealed itself as pattern before it revealed itself as objects. The enemy's communications faltered, then hissed, then returned, then fell again as if a singer had lost the vowel. That was enough. Bulwark-tuned jammers, stripped to bare component stacks and crammed into Aegis bays, cut thrust, drifted to prefigured coordinates and lit themselves like false stars. Elythian targeters tasted a sky newly salted with lies. Hammerfalls raced through the momentary paleness, ripping open housings that had looked like dust and proved to be the exoskeletons of transmitters. Ironclads rolled, their rails stitching calm across a frantic map. The Eclipse did not fire. There is such a thing as overusing awe. When the last transmitter died, the human formation shrank to a thread and was gone. Silence, the other kind, filled the space where the lattice had been. Human ships did not celebrate. They took bearings and counted hulls and checked the edges of shields, and for the first time in the war began to feel something more complicated than relief. They felt the contour of a future in which resistance was not only reaction, but authorship. On the worlds that had given up sleeping through the night, the transformation continued to seep into everything that called itself daily life. Ration lines became coordination briefings. Weddings were scheduled at shift transitions so that entire work blocks could attend without starving a line or dimming a shield. Birth announcements included the assignment of the newborn's first training cohort, pure ceremony for now, and a vow that there would be a later. Cemeteries moved indoors, not out of shame, but because alloy vaults could be ground, smelted, and turned into plating when grief ripened into the need for metal. Priests of every living belief learned to bless coolant lines and reactor cores. The old gods took on new jurisdictions. Even art, that stubborn thing, did not desert the war. Painters learned the palette of plasma glow on armor and made it tender. Composers wrote in tempos derived from the charge cycles of Bulwark capacitors. Audiences who had learned to feel those cycles in their bones wept when the harmonies broke and reformed around a held note that sounded like an ironclad's stability. Children chalked Eclipse silhouettes on the sides of food printers. No one scolded. If a civilization must teach itself new myths, let them be large enough to stand against the sky. And always the question remained, how many victories make a habit? The Accord answered by refusing to look for comfort where none was useful. Numbers replaced adjectives. The shipyards published weekly outputs as public liturgy. Frigate loss rates, destroyer repair turnarounds, average ironclad shield dwell under sustained lance. These statistics were chanted in halls where once peace delegations had toasted one another with glass clinks and laughter. Humanity learned to be proud, not of how it felt, but of what it could count. The galaxy, watching, did not clap. Some neighbors dimmed their listening posts, lest attention be contagious. Others recorded, studied, and said nothing because words bind. A handful moved pieces no one yet recognized as moves. The Elythians, for their part, seemed to compress. Their fleets arrived in formations that suggested caution, wearing the mask of contempt. They probed for the edges of the human weave and found that edges had been replaced by gradients. No neat boundaries to slice, only thickness that thinned and then thickened elsewhere. It was in that ambiguity that the Accord found the courage to name the thing it had become. Resistance was no longer a moment, or a gesture, or a shout against a storm. It was an architecture, a way of arranging energy and attention. In a brief broadcast that reached every colony, every habitat, every darkened room where someone feared to hope, a voice without signature spoke for the civilization. We are not waiting to be spared. We are learning to save ourselves. From this hour, we do not mark time by what we lost, but by what we can now refuse to lose. The hours that followed were not quieter, but they were cleaner in the mind. Orders carried the weight of a shape that finally matched the pressure of reality. The Eclipse accepted its position in the lattice, no longer the miracle at the end of a prayer, but the discipline at the heart of a sentence. Aegis lines practiced dying better, not longer, but more usefully. Hammerfalls drilled not on gunnery, but on restraint, learning the geometry of not taking a shot that would shatter a pattern. Ironclads proved their holiness by staying. Bulwarks by returning power to the grid even while under fire. And somewhere beyond the visible curve of human effort, the Elythians prepared an answer, because that is what enemies do. The Accord did not pretend otherwise. Preparation is its own kind of speech. Humanity spoke it fluently now. The rhythm of survival had become the cadence of resistance, and from cadence grew ambition. For the first time in centuries, the Accord's military planners dared to speak of strategy in terms of expansion, not retreat. It was not enough to fortify Sol and its colonies. If the Elythians were allowed to dictate the geometry of conflict, humanity would wither, starved of resources, hemmed into its cradle until attrition closed its throat. The Accord needed to project power outward, to claw space from the enemy's grasp and declare it human. The choice of target fell upon the Gate of Hades, a slipstream junction beyond Neptune, a relic of ancient exploration long abandoned when peace had made such shortcuts unnecessary. It was a crossing of invisible lines where gravitational currents converged into a transit corridor that linked Sol to the deeper void. The Elythians had begun to use it, not yet as a fortress, but as a staging post for raids. If humanity could seize it, they would claim not only a resource, but a symbol, the right to extend their reach. The operation was vast, dwarfing Intercept Theta and the Vesta defense. It demanded coordination across every class of ship, every doctrine refined in the crucible of failure. The Aegis swarms would scatter into the dust, painting false pictures across the enemy's sensors. Hammerfalls would form hunting packs, diving from concealment at the first sign of weakness. Ironclads would take the center, as immovable anchors against the torrent. Bulwarks, dragged at colossal expense into position over weeks of silent, crawling thrust, would become the spine of the defense once the field was claimed. And presiding over it all, the Eclipse would wait for the moment to unmake the battle. Preparation for Hades was as much a cultural act as a logistical one. Entire colonies synchronized their cycles to the countdown of the operation. Schools dismissed children early so families could watch the fleet departures. Factories hung banners over their gates, not of ideology, but of production quotas, marking the number of hulls completed in time for the assault. On Earth, where ancient rivers still glimmered beneath skies scarred by the debris of fallen stations, Crowds gathered in plazas to hear broadcasts from commanders who refused to speak in heroics, offering instead the raw figures of readiness, numbers of ships, tonnage of armor, the measured probability of survival. Hope was not sold in words, but in data. The Elythians arrived before the humans had fully committed, as though sensing intent. Their fleets glided into the Hades corridor with the arrogance of inevitability, crystalline hulls refracting starlight into cold rainbows. Humanity met them not with desperation, but with orchestration. The Aegis frigates blossomed in their thousands, each a spark in a sea of confusion. Lances fired, but the void was too thick with decoys and false trails to find clean purchase. Into this storm, the Hammerfalls dove, tearing open the flanks of Elythian screens with rail batteries and torpedoes that scattered fragments into the dust. The Ironclads arrived next, burning steadily into position, their shields overlapping into a wall of force. Elythian lances cracked against them, brilliant arcs rippling across their hulls, but the cruisers held, and the rhythm of their rail fire did not falter. Behind them, the first Bulwark lit its shields. The fortress had been dragged across millions of kilometers of void to stand here, and when its point defense arrays came alive, the sky itself thickened into a mesh of protective fire. The Elythians pressed harder, releasing drone swarms in torrents, carving paths through the frigate clouds, threatening to collapse the Accord's fragile weave. The Hammerfalls bled, one by one, consumed by lances too precise to evade forever. Even the Ironclads groaned beneath the weight of continuous fire, their armor plates glowing with the heat of near collapse. For a moment, it seemed the doctrine would fracture under its own ambition. And then the Eclipse moved. It emerged from shadow, like a continent sliding into view, its hull gleaming with the faint shimmer of active shields. The Elythians pivoted toward it instinctively, lances converging on the Titan that had scarred their pride above Mars. The Eclipse absorbed their fury in silence, its shields flaring white, its armor plates blackening but unbroken. For long minutes it endured, until its particle lance fired. A single Elythian cruiser dissolved, erased by the beam's merciless focus. The fleet staggered, hesitated, then surged again. The Eclipse fired a second time, annihilating another warship, and the hesitation deepened into fear. The Accord's fleets surged forward with renewed fury, Aegis swarms overwhelming drones, Hammerfalls slicing apart escorts, Ironclads advancing step by step like marching fortresses. The Bulwark's shields expanded, anchoring the entire formation. For the first time, the Elythians broke, withdrawing from a contested field not because they had finished their work, but because they could not finish it at all. Humanity had won. Not a skirmish, not a reprieve, a victory. The news spread across the Accord with a force greater than any weapon. The gate of Hades was theirs. Humanity had fought not on the doorstep of Sul, but beyond it, in contested space, and endured. The victory was paid in blood. Thousands of ships lost, tens of thousands dead. But for the first time, those deaths were not the cost of stalling annihilation. They were the price of shaping the war. In the aftermath, the Accord declared a new doctrine of civilization itself. No longer would humanity define itself as a people caught in the jaws of betrayal, surviving on scraps of hope. It was now a civilization of resistance, a civilization capable of reaching outward, capable of dictating where battles would be fought and why. The old utopia was dead, but in its ashes, a new identity had taken root. And yet, within the councils, voices of caution whispered beneath the triumph. The Elythians had been tested, but not broken. Their retreat was not defeat. It was study. They would return with new formations, new weapons, new strategies, and when they did, the cost of holding the line would rise again. Humanity had taken its first step into resistance, but the war had only begun to reveal its depth. Above Mars, the Eclipse returned to its dockyards, scarred and battered, its lance cooling after the fury of battle. Workers swarmed its hull like ants tending to a wounded god, patching plates, replacing conduits, whispering prayers that blurred into curses. To some, the ship was already legend. To others, it was a monument to all they had lost, but to all, it was necessary. The Terran Accord had resisted, and now it would learn to endure the storm that was still coming. The Gate of Hades became more than a victory. It became a declaration. Humanity had crossed a threshold, from prey clawing for survival to predator daring to choose its ground. Across the colonies, the news of the battle replayed endlessly. Families crowded into communal halls to watch the grainy transmissions, frigates darting like sparks, destroyers charging headlong into fire, ironclads absorbing the fury of lancers, the Bulwark's shields glowing like a second sun, and towering above it all, the Eclipse carving holes in the void. For the first time since the betrayal, despair did not drown the Accord's people. For the first time, they spoke of tomorrow without choking on the word. But victories are not meals, and inspiration does not fill supply chains. The cost of Hades was staggering. Hundreds of frigates annihilated, dozens of Hammerfalls crippled or lost, ironclads limping home with their hulls torn open, bleeding atmosphere into the dark. The Bulwark that had anchored the fight would never return. Its generators had melted under the strain, its crew burning themselves alive to keep the shield intact, long enough for the Eclipse to strike. In their sacrifice, the Accord had learned the meaning of holding a line. The response on Earth was brutal pragmatism. Rationing deepened. Industries that had clung to remnants of civilian luxury were stripped bare, their workers folded into the endless cycle of shipbuilding. Old cities, still decorated with monuments to peace, were gutted for raw material. Statues of diplomats melted into armor plating. Museums donated their steel beams. Libraries, their rare alloys hidden in ancient printers. Universities, their laboratories now pressed into reactor testing. Humanity cannibalized its utopia to feed the hunger of its resistance. Philosophy shifted again. Where once debates had wrestled with the morality of peace, now the question was survival at scale. What sacrifices are justified when extinction is the alternative? What is the value of individuality when every life must fit into the lattice of endurance? The thinkers of the Accord no longer published volumes of reflection. They wrote manuals, doctrines, and manifestos of survival. The word sacrifice ceased to be mournful. It became a currency, exchanged as readily as energy or ore. Culture followed. Songs composed in the rhythm of Bulwark capacitors became anthems, sung by workers and soldiers alike. Plays retold the stories of lost colonies, not as tragedies, but as warnings, urging vigilance. Painters covered entire habitats with murals of fleets in formation. The Eclipse at their center, its lance raised like a sword of fire. Even grief was choreographed. Funerals shortened, rituals compressed, so that mourning could flow seamlessly into labor. A civilization cannot afford to stop moving in war. Even its sorrow must march. And yet, beneath the unity, there were fractures. Whispers spread in the outer colonies. The cost was too high, the burden too heavy. Some argued that peace, even under Elythian rule, was preferable to annihilation. The Accord stamped down such voices with severity. To speak of surrender was to invite extinction. Still, the whispers lingered, faint but persistent, like cracks in an armored hull. The Elythians, too, had learned. Their retreat at Hades was not a defeat, but an experiment. They had tested the Eclipse's endurance, tasted the lattice of human fleet doctrine, measured the depth of their resolve. They now understood that humanity was no longer a prey animal, but a predator in the making. And predators, to be broken, must be cornered and crushed utterly. The signs of their preparation multiplied. Reconnaissance drones, once scattered, now probed the periphery of Sul with precision. Small fleets advanced and then vanished, not in panic, but in silence, as if charting invisible lines. Human intelligence analysts pieced together fragments, and the shape that emerged was grim. The Elythians were concentrating, not dispersing. They were preparing a blow not against a corridor or a mining colony, but against the heart of humanity itself. The Terran Council debated endlessly, but one truth cut through the arguments. The siege of Sol was coming. The Elythians would not tolerate a prey species rising into defiance. They would bring their full might against Earth, Mars, and every world that dared still fly the Accord's banner. In preparation, humanity worked like never before. New bulwarks were towed into orbit around Earth, their shields layered in a defensive web. Shipyards in the asteroid belt produced ironclads at unsustainable rates, their workers collapsing from exhaustion, their reactors running hot beyond safety. Hammerfalls and Aegis frigates swarmed through space, practicing maneuvers that blurred the line between simulation and suicide. And the Eclipse, scarred, blackened, patched but unbroken, was elevated to a symbol not just of survival, but of destiny. Propaganda spoke plainly. When Sul burns, we will endure. When Sul endures, humanity endures. Citizens painted the slogan on walls, on ships, even on the undersides of orbital platforms. It was not optimism. It was not denial. It was a vow forged in fire. And so Episode 4 closed not with triumph, but with silence. A silence heavy with anticipation, like the pause between the drawing of breath and the shattering of glass. The Terran Accord had resisted, had fought, had won. But the greatest trial still waited. In the cold darkness beyond Neptune, where Elythian fleets gathered like thunderheads, the storm was forming. And soon it would break upon Sul.